The winter of 1892 did not arrive in Boston with a whisper. It arrived with a blade. The workshop was silent. Until someone knocked, not like a customer, not like a debt collector, like someone whose whole life depended on the answer waiting behind my door. The oil lamp on my workbench flickered. It cast long, skeletal shadows against the wall of saws. The fire in the small hearth was dying. It gasped for the last of the birch logs. I didn't mind the cold. Cold is predictable. It wasn't the heavy, authoritative rap of a debt collector. It wasn't the hurried bang of a customer with a broken chair. It was soft, hesitant, a sound like a bird hitting a window pane in a storm. I set down my chisel. I wiped my hands on a grease-stained rag. When I opened the heavy oak door, the Boston night rushed in. It brought a flurry of white. It brought a woman who looked like she was made of shadows and glass. Evelyn. She lived 3 doors down in a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and lost hope. We had exchanged nods across the street for 6 months. I knew she had a child. I knew she worked until her fingers bled at the textile mill. I knew her eyes were the color of the sea just before a gale. She didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped inside to... She clutched her shawl tightly against her throat. Her breath came out in ragged, silvery plumes. The heat of my workshop seemed to offend her frozen skin. She stood near the pile of fresh pine boards. The scent of resin filled the space between us. She looked at the floor. She looked at the rows of sharp, gleaming tools on my wall. Her hands were shaking. It wasn't just the cold, it was the kind of tremor that starts in the soul. "Thomas," she said. Her voice was thin, like worn velvet. I waited. I am good at waiting. Wood takes time to season. People take time to find their courage. She looked up, for the first time. I saw the true depth of the exhaustion etched into her face. She looked a decade older than her years. "I need a favor," she whispered. "A favor that no honest woman should ask of a stranger." I leaned back against my workbench. The edge of the wood pressed into my spine. "I'm a carpenter, Evelyn," I said. "I fix things that are made of timber." She took a step closer. The light of the lamp caught the moisture in her eyes. "I need you to fix a life," she said. She took a breath that seemed to catch in her lungs. "Can you be the father of my boy just for one day?" At first, I thought I heard her wrong. No woman asked a stranger for something like that. Not unless tomorrow was worse than death. The world went still. The wind outside seemed to stop its howling just to hear my answer. A father. The word felt foreign in this room of sharp edges and solitude. I thought of my own father. He was a man who spoke in grunts. He taught me that a straight line was the only thing you could trust. I thought of the empty cradle I had built 5 years ago. I had burned it 6 months later. The memory of that fire felt hotter than the stove beside me. I looked at Evelyn. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for a husband. She was asking for a mask. She needed a man's presence to shield her. In 1892, a woman alone was a target. A woman alone with a child was a tragedy waiting to be written. The Boston Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was active then. They were known as the Cruelty Men. They patrolled the tenements. They looked for reasons to declare a home unfit. They looked for excuses to tear families apart. I saw the desperation in the way she gripped her shawl. Her knuckles were white. I saw the fear of a mother staring into the mouth of a wolf. I moved to the stove. I tossed the last log onto the embers. The wood hissed and caught. It sent a warm glow across the room. The smell of pine smoke grew thicker. I turned back to her. My face was shadowed. "A day is a long time to live a lie," I said. "I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to be anything but a man with a saw." She stepped into the circle of light. "You just have to stand there," she said. "You just have to let them see that he belongs to someone, that I belong to someone." I looked into those tired, sea-gray eyes. I saw the ghosts of 1,000 sleepless nights. I saw the weight of a secret she had been carrying. She had carried it through the slush and the mud of this city. I could feel the pull of it. It was the human need to reach out. It was the urge to stop someone from drowning. but I am a man of conditions. I don't build a house without seeing the blueprints. I'll do it, I said. The relief that washed over her face was almost painful. She closed her eyes. She let out a sob she had been holding for miles. But, I added, my voice hardened, she froze. Only if you tell me why. Only if you tell me the truth about what is coming for you tomorrow. I won't walk into a storm without knowing which way the wind is blowing. The shadows danced on the walls. The fire crackled. A sharp, sudden pop broke the silence. Evelyn looked at me. I realized then that the secret was heavier than the child. She looked at the door. She looked back at me. The clock on the wall ticked with a heavy, metallic finality. Evelyn pulled a small, tattered photograph from her pocket. She didn't show it to me yet. She just held it against her heart. The law doesn't care about love, Thomas, she said. It only cares about names on a piece of paper. And tomorrow, they are coming to take my son's name away. She walked toward the fire. The warmth finally reached her. My son is not just a boy, sir, she continued. He is the heir to a name and they want to bury. His father was a cavalryman named Caleb. We exchanged vows before he rode away, but there was no minister and no legal certificate. He never returned. Now the law says Leo has no recognized father. They want to send him away on an orphan train. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The orphan trains were a shadow over the city. They took children from the streets of the east. They shipped them to farms in the west. Sometimes they found homes. Often, they found only labor and loneliness. They say I am unfit because I have no husband, she whispered. They say my poverty is a crime against his bloodline. She finally turned the photograph around. It was a tintype of a small boy with serious eyes. He looked like her. He had the same sea-gray gaze, but he also had a stubborn set to his jaw. Han looked like a fighter. Tomorrow, the inspectors will visit my room at the boarding house, she said. If they remain suspicious, they will summon us to City Hall. They will ask for the father. If I cannot produce one, they take him. They take my Leo. They were speaking about legal custody, not physical harm. But to a mother, the fear felt just as devastating. I reached out. I touched the rough surface of the workbench. The wood was solid. It was real. The world she was describing was a world of ghosts and paper. It was a world where a man's signature was worth more than a mother's soul. Why me? I asked. Why a carpenter with no family of his own? She looked at my hand. She looked at the scars from decades of labor. Because you have the hands of a man who build, she said. You have the eyes of a man who knows what it means to lose everything. I've watched you, Thomas. I've watched you look at that empty house of yours. I know you carry a fire that went out a long time ago. Her words cut deeper than any blade. She was right. I had built that cradle for a son who never drew a breath. I had watched my wife fade away in the fever of 1887. I had spent 5 years turning my heart into a block of oak. Hard, unyielding, cold. But here was a woman offering a chance to be human again. Even if it was a lie. Even if it was only for 24 hours. I have no suit, I said. I have no fine words for inspectors. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the sleeve of my heavy wool shirt. The touch was light. It felt like a spark on dry tinder. You have your dignity, Thomas, she said. That is all they need to see. They need to see that we are not broken. They need to see that we are a wall they cannot climb. I looked at the dying fire. I thought about the meaning of justice. In 1892, justice was a luxury for the rich. For the rest of us, there was only survival. There was only the strength we lent to one another. Dignity isn't something you are born with. It is something you carve out of a hard life. It is the choice to stand straight when the wind wants to bend you. It is the courage to protect something smaller than yourself. What time do they come? I asked. 10 in the morning, she replied. But I need you at my door before dawn. We must look like a family before anyone begins watching. I nodded. I felt a strange weight in my chest. It wasn't the heaviness of grief. It was the weight of a foundation being poured. Go home, Evelyn, I said. Get some sleep. I will be at your door before the first light hits the frost." She didn't move for a moment. She just looked at me. The tears she had been fighting finally spilled over. They tracked lines through the dust of the mill on her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She leaned forward. She pressed her forehead against my shoulder. I didn't pull away. I stood there like a pillar. I let her lean on me. I let her breathe in the scent of sawdust and oil. For a moment, the workshop wasn't a place of labor. It was a sanctuary. It was a fortress against the cruel machines of the world. "Thank you," she breathed. The words were barely a whisper, but they filled the room. She turned and walked to the door. She vanished into the white swirl of the storm. I stood in the silence. The clock continued to tick. I looked at my tools. They were cold. They were inanimate. But tomorrow, I would use them to build something invisible. I would build a lie that was more honorable than the truth. I would stand in the face of the law. I would claim a child that wasn't mine. I would be a father. I walked to the corner of the room. I pulled a dusty trunk from under a pile of lumber. Inside, there was a black coat. It was the one I had worn to a funeral 5 years ago. I shook it out. The scent of cedar and old sorrow filled the air. I brushed off the dust. I laid it across the workbench. Justice was coming, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready for the storm. I sat by the embers. I watched the last glow of the birch log fade into ash. A man's worth is not measured by his gold. It is measured by the shadows he is willing to face for another. Evelyn was a stranger, but her pain was my own. Tomorrow, we would walk into the mouth of the wolf together, and I would make sure the wolf broke its teeth. The wind howled one last time against the glass. I closed my eyes. I waited for the dawn. I waited for the bell. I waited to become the man I thought I had buried. I thought about the man I had never met. Caleb had not abandoned them. He had simply died before he could protect the family he left behind. I could not replace him, but for one day, I could stand where he no longer could. I turned and looked at her. The firelight caught the red in her hair. "I'll be there at dawn," I said. My voice was a low growl in the quiet shop. "I have a clean shirt. I'll shave. I'll play the part so well they'll think I was born for it." I meant it. I would become the lie. Evelyn took a step toward me. The floorboards creaked under her boots. This time, she did touch me. She placed a hand on my forearm. Her fingers were small. They were rough from hard work. The warmth of her skin seeped through my heavy wool shirt. It was a strange, electric sensation. I had been a hermit in this shop for 5 long years. I had forgotten the weight of a human touch. I had forgotten how a person's gravity can pull you in. "Why, Thomas?" she asked. Her eyes were wide and searching. "You could have said no. You could have stayed here in the warmth of your wood and your silence." I looked past her. The cradle sat in this corner. The light played on the child's forehead. He looked like an angel carved from moonlight. "I built a cradle once," I said. The words were heavy. They felt like stones I had carried in my pockets for a lifetime. For a son who never got to breathe. I spent a month carving the spindles. I spent a week polishing the wood until it shone like gold. When he died, I took it to the back alley. I set it on fire. I looked into her eyes. I wanted her to see the ash in my soul. I watched it burn because I couldn't stand the sight of a promise that went unkept. "I'm not doing this just for you, Evelyn. I'm doing it because I want to see a child stay in the cradle he was meant for. I want one promise to hold." She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The air in the shop shifted. The lie we were planning began to feel like a covenant. It was a quiet, desperate war against the cold of Boston. She walked to the cradle. She began to wrap the child in a heavy wool blanket. The boy didn't wake. He just sighed. He tucked his head into the warmth of her neck. "I'll have the coffee ready," she said. She headed for the door. She paused with her hand on the iron latch. "Thank you, Thomas." "Don't thank me yet," I said. "The sun hasn't come up. The inspectors haven't arrived." She opened the door. The Boston winter rushed back in like a physical blow. The snow swirled around her skirt. She disappeared into the white. She was a shadow carrying a miracle. I stood in the center of my shop. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was the silence of a house before a storm. It was the silence of a soldier checking his rifle. I went to the sink. I splashed ice-cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the cracked mirror above the basin. I saw a man who had spent too much time talking to timber. I saw a man who was about to lie to the world to save a soul. I went to my trunk. I pulled out my best boots. They were dusty. I polished them until the black leather mirrored the dying fire. I found my white linen shirt, the one I wore to my mother's funeral. The collar was stiff. I laid it out on the workbench. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the stove. I watched the clock. Tick, tick, tick. Every second was a reminder of the mask I had promised to wear. I thought about the inspectors from the Charity Organization Society. I knew their kind. Men with clipboards and cold hearts. Men who thought poverty was a character flaw. They would come with their rulers. They would try to measure love with a checklist. They wouldn't find what they were looking for, because I was going to give them a father made of iron and oak. I looked at the empty spot where the cradle had been. The floorboards were still marked by the runners. I reached down. I touched the wood. It was cold. But for the first time in 5 years, my blood was hot. I felt a terrifying sense of purpose. I wasn't just fixing a chair. I was fixing a life. Evelyn wasn't the only one being saved. The man who was never going to be a father was finally getting his day. Even if it was built on a deception, even if it only lasted until the sun went down. I stood up. I walked to the window. The sky was turning a pale, bruised purple. The morning was coming. The audit was coming. I picked up my razor. I began to sharpen the blade on the leather strap. Slap, slap, slap. The sound of steel on leather was the only thing I could hear. It was the sound of a man preparing for battle. A battle fought with a steady hand and a quiet voice. I looked out at the street. The gas lamps were flickering out, one by one, like stars dying in the dawn. I put on my shirt. I buttoned the cuffs. The linen felt like armor. I stepped out into the cold. The snow crunched under my boots. I walked toward the boarding house 3 doors down. I didn't look back at my shop. I didn't look back at the man who lived alone. I was Thomas, the father. The world was about to believe me. The boarding house room was small. It smelled of dried lavender and stale coal smoke. A single oil lamp flickered on a low table. It cast long, trembling shadows against the floral wallpaper. The paper was peeling at the corners. It looked like the skin of an old, tired world. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. A heavy quilt was spread across her lap. "Sit," she said. She gestured to a ladder-back chair. It looked like it had survived the Great Fire of 1872. I sat. My knees felt too high. My shoulders felt too wide for this cramped space. "If the inspectors come tomorrow, they will look at the details," she whispered. She didn't look at me. She looked at a jagged tear in the corner of the quilt. "They will look for a man's touch in the house. They look for the things that prove a woman isn't alone. A mended hinge, a patch blanket." She held out a silver needle. A length of thick, ivory thread trailed from it. "I can't sew, Evelyn," I said. My voice sounded like gravel. I held up my hands. They were calloused. They were scarred from 20 years of battling oak and pine. My fingernails were stained with walnut oil. "My mother taught me something," she replied. She looked up. Her eyes were wet but steady. She said a man who can build a house should be able to hold it together. She reached out. She took my right hand. Her skin was cool against my heat. She placed the needle between my thumb and forefinger. "Push it through the linen. Thomas." Slowly. "Catch the edge of the blue scrap, then the white." I leaned forward. I could smell the faint scent of her hair. It smelled like rain and lye soap. It was the smell of survival. I pushed the needle into the fabric. The resistance of the old linen was surprising. It was tough. It had been washed 1,000 times. It had survived years of hunger and hard winters. The sound of the needle piercing the weave was a tiny, rhythmic thrip, thrip, thrip. "The boy," I whispered. "What is his name?" "Leo," she said. "After my father. He was a stonemason. He died when the scaffolding broke at the State House. I nodded. I knew that story. Half the men in Boston were buried under the buildings they built. Leo will have a better story, I said. I pulled the thread tight. He will have a father who stays. She leaned her head toward mine. For a moment, the needle stopped. The world outside was a frozen wasteland. The law was coming to take her child. The city was a machine that ground up the poor. But in this room, there was a stitch, a single ivory stitch holding two pieces of scrap together. Thomas, she breathed. What if they see through us? What if they see the carpenter instead of the husband? I looked at the quilt. I looked at the way our hands were inches apart. Then I will tell them that I am a man who found his soul in a pile of wood. I will tell them that a family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build, one shaving at a time, one stitch at a time. I pushed the needle through again. I felt the weight of her leaning against my shoulder. It wasn't a heavy weight. It was the weight of trust. It was heavier than any mountain. I thought of my wife. I thought of the day the doctor told me the fever had won. I had stood in an empty house for 1,800 days. I had waited for a reason to wake up. Now, the reason was breathing in a cradle across the room. The reason was the woman teaching me how to mend a life. You're doing it, she whispered. I looked down. The tear was closing. The blue scrap and the white scrap were becoming one. It wasn't perfect. The stitches were uneven. They were the stitches of a man who knew more about hammers than silk, but they were strong. They would hold. Justice isn't in their books. Evelyn, I said, justice is what we do when the world turns its back. I looked at her. I saw the hope in her eyes. It was a fragile thing, like a candle in a gale. I reached out. I didn't use the needle. I used my thumb to wipe a stray tear from her cheek. Her skin was like velvet. We'll win, I said, because I have nothing left to lose but this. And I've become very good at holding on to things. She smiled. It was a small, broken smile. But it lit the room better than the lamp. She put her hand over mine. We sat there. Two strangers in a cold city, stitching a lie into a truth. The sun began to bleed through the frost on the window. The hour of the wolf was here. I stood up. I straightened my mother's funeral shirt. I looked at the quilt. I looked at the woman. I looked at the child. Let them come, I said. I'm ready to be the man I was supposed to be. I walked to the door. I didn't feel like a carpenter anymore. I felt like a fortress. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. The first knock on the door sounded like a gunshot. It was 10 o'clock. The inspectors had arrived. I didn't flinch. I reached for the latch. I looked back at Evelyn one last time. Remember, I whispered, you are my wife, and this is our home. I opened the door. The world was waiting. But I was the mountain, and I was standing in the gap. The audit had begun, but they had already lost, because a man with a purpose is a man who cannot be broken. I smiled at the men in the suits. Good morning, gentlemen, I said. Please come in out of the cold. My family is just finishing breakfast. The lie was perfect, because I finally believed it myself. The needle was in my pocket. The thread was in my heart, and the child was safe in his cradle. That was the only truth that mattered. In a city of stone, I was the living wood, and I was not going to burn, not today, not ever again. I stepped back. I let them in. The battle was joined, and I was exactly where I was meant to be, beside her, for him, for us. The journey had only just begun, but the foundation was solid. I had built it with my own two hands, and I would defend it with my life. That is the dignity of a man. That is the price of a soul. I closed the door. The snow stayed outside. The warmth stayed within. We were a family, and God help anyone who tried to say otherwise. The rhythmic click of the needle against the thimble pulled a sharp chord in my chest. Suddenly, the damp walls of a Boston boarding house in 1892 dissolved. The bitter chill of the Atlantic winter softened into a dry, suffocating heat. The acrid smell of coal smoke transformed into the scent of burning buffalo chips. It was 1874. I was a boy of 8 years. I was sitting on the packed dirt floor of a sod house on the Nebraska prairie. The prairie wind howled outside. It was a hungry animal, searching for a gap in the mud bricks to swallow us whole. My mother sat exactly where Evelyn sat now. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the earth walls. She wore a dress fashioned from bleached flour sacks. The faded Pillsbury logo was still visible near the hem. Her hands were red and cracked. The winter wind had flayed her skin, but her fingers moved with a grace that defied the poverty of our surroundings. She was sewing a quilt just like this one. She told me that every scrap of fabric was a living ghost. "This red square was your father's Sunday shirt," she whispered. "The one he wore when he asked for my hand in Kentucky. This checked pattern was your grandmother's apron. She wore it when she walked across the mountains with nothing but a Bible and a cast-iron skillet." I remembered the way her needle moved. It was a bird darting through tall prairie grass. It was the only quiet thing in a world of storms. "Thomas?" Evelyn's voice shattered the glass of the memory. I realized my hand had frozen in midair. I was staring at the quilt. My eyes burned with a sudden, unwanted salt. "You're holding your breath," she said softly. I let it out. It felt like a leaden weight finally leaving my lungs. "My mother died in '78, I said. The words felt like dry husks in my mouth. "The fever took her and my sisters in 3 days. The great grasshopper plague had already taken the crops. There was nothing left but the dust and the graves. I was 12, and I was the only one left to dig the holes. I remember the sound of the shovel hitting the frozen Nebraska ground. It didn't sound like earth. It sounded like stone breaking. I looked at the blue patch under my thumb. She was sewing a quilt when the coughing started. The needle was still in the cloth when we buried her. She never got to finish the pattern." Evelyn did not pull her hand away. Instead, she moved her fingers over the back of my hand. She was steady. She was solid. She guided my clumsy fingers, pulling the needle back through the heavy fabric. "My brother died at Gettysburg," she said. Her voice was a low, steady vibration. It carried the weight of a million unspoken prayers. "He was 19. A boy from the Boston docks who had never seen a field larger than a vacant lot. He sent a letter home a week before the battle. The paper was stained with coffee and grease. He said he was tired of being hungry. He said he missed the way the morning mist sat on the harbor. He missed the smell of salt and rotting fish." She pulled the thread tight. The sound was a tiny, definitive snap. When the news came, my mother didn't cry. She didn't scream at God. She just sat by the cold hearth and started unraveling his old wool sweaters, the ones he had outgrown. She said she couldn't let his warmth go to waste in a drawer. She knitted those sweaters into blankets for the orphans in the North End. Every stitch was a way of keeping him alive in another mother's arms. We sat in the silence for a long time. The only sound was the thrip of the needle. In the corner, the boy breathed with a soft, rhythmic huff. He was a small, warm bundle of hope in a city that felt like an icebox. In that moment, the masks we wore began to melt. We weren't two strangers playing a dangerous game of pretend. We weren't a carpenter with a dark past and a desperate mother with a stolen child. We were two survivors of the same endless war, the war of living, the war of keeping a fire lit when the wood is soaking wet. I watched her profile in the dim lamplight. The lines around her eyes were deep. They were maps of every mile she had walked in the shadows. They were the records of every tear she had refused to shed. I felt a strange, quiet ache in my chest. It wasn't the sharp, jagged pain of the cradle I had burned in the alley. It was a dull, thrumming heat. It was the agonizing feeling of a frozen limb beginning to wake up. It hurt to feel. "There," she said. She snipped the thread with her teeth. The tear in my trousers was gone. The stitches were uneven and heavy. They weren't the work of a professional tailor, but they were strong. They were reinforced with a double knot. They would hold against the wind. "Now you look like a man who stays," she said. She looked me directly in the eyes. The paralyzing fear I had seen in the shop earlier was gone. In its place was a quiet, dangerous resolve. It was the look of a woman who had already looked into the abyss and didn't blink. "They will ask how we met," she reminded me. I nodded. The plan was the only thing that could save us. At the shipyard, I said, near the old dry docks where the wind smells like cedar and pitch. You were selling apples from a wicker basket. You looked like a queen in a faded shawl. I bought 3 apples I didn't want. Just to see you smile, she nodded, a ghost of a grin touching her lips. And the boy, I looked over at the cradle. He has my grandfather's nose, I said, the one that survived the Irish potato famine and 3 shipwrecks. And he has his father's stubbornness. The lie tasted like iron. It was cold and metallic, but it felt like a shield. It felt like the only justice we would ever get. I picked up the quilt and ran my hand over the fabric. It was rough and honest. I haven't talked about my mother in 20 years, I confessed. I didn't look at her. I looked at the shadow of the needle on the floor. Sometimes I think if I don't speak their names, they never really left. If I keep the silence, I can pretend they are just in the next room. But the silence is a heavy thing to carry, Thomas, she replied. It's a poison that rots the heart from the inside out. She stood up and walked to the window. She pulled back the heavy, dust-caked curtain. The snow was falling thick now. It was a white shroud muffling the screams of the city. It covered the filth and the coal dust. Tomorrow, we go to the market, she said. We don't hide. We don't whisper. We walk together. We let them see us. We let the world see a family. I stood up and smoothed the wrinkles in my wool trousers. My hands were no longer shaking. The needle had done more than fix a garment. It had stitched a thin, invisible thread between her ghosts and mine. It had tied our fates together with a knot that no auditor could untie. I should go, I said. The sun will be up in 4 hours. The city will wake up hungry. She turned from the window. The blue light of the snow hit her face. For a fleeting second, she looked younger. She looked like the girl who might have sold apples at the shipyard. She looked like a woman who believed in a future. Thank you for remembering, Thomas, for remembering your mother. It makes you a better man than the one who left that Nebraska farm. I walked to the door. The brass handle was cold. I'm not doing it to be a better man, Evelyn. I said. I looked back at her one last time. The boy stirred in his sleep, his tiny hand reaching out for a dream. I'm doing it because I'm tired of digging holes. I'm tired of burying things that should have lived. I stepped out into the hallway. The air was freezing. The boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and old damp wood, but the heat in my chest didn't fade. I walked down the stairs. My boots echoed on the worn timber. I thought about the 1870s. I thought about the endless prairie and the sound of the grasshoppers. And for the first time in my life, the memory didn't hurt. It didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a tool, a hammer to build a wall, a needle to close a gap. I stepped out into the Boston night. The snow covered my tracks as soon as I made them. It was as if I didn't exist to the rest of the world. But I knew where I was going. I was going to a market. I was going to be a father. I was going to fight for that boy as if he were my own blood. I would fight for him as if he had been born in the very cradle I had burned to keep him warm. The morning air was a razor. It cut through the seams of my heavy wool coat. It found the skin beneath and bit hard. Boston was waking up in a gray shroud of mist. The coal smoke from the factories hung low over the streets. I stood at the corner of the boarding house. My boots crunched on the thin crust of overnight ice. The sound was like breaking glass, for the world was waking up. The enemies were putting on their suits. The men with the ledger books and the cold hearts were preparing their questions. But they didn't know about the quilt. They didn't know about the thread. Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She was the ghost in a faded blue shawl. She was holding a bundle wrapped tightly in the mended quilt. Her face was pale. The skin was pulled tight over her cheekbones. She looked at the street. She looked at the gray, uncaring world. "Are you sure, Thomas?" she whispered. The steam from her breath drifted between us. It was a prayer in the cold. It was a question of life and death. "Give him to me," I said. I reached out my arms. I took the weight of the child. I took the weight of her past. I took the weight of our shared lie. And I walked into the light. Because dignity isn't something given by a judge. Dignity is something you sew yourself. One stitch at a time, in the dark, against the wind. The audit had begun, but we had already won, because a man who has found a reason to live is a man who can never be defeated. I held the boy close. I felt his small heart beating against mine. It was the only drumbeat that mattered. We turned the corner, the market was waiting, the battle was joined, and we were no longer alone. We were a family. God help anyone who tried to say otherwise. Leo was not just a bundle of cloth. He was a furnace of living heat against my chest. I adjusted my hold, surprised by how lightly the thin boy rested against me. He was heavier than a sack of flour. He was heavier than the seasoned oak beams I notched for a living. This was the weight of a soul. I tucked his small, damp face into the hollow of my neck. I could smell him. He smelled of plain soap, wool, and the faint sweetness of breakfast. It was a scent that didn't belong in the soot of Boston. His heartbeat was a frantic, tiny rhythm. It felt like a hummingbird trapped in my palm. I looked at Evelyn. Her eyes were wide, rimmed with the red of exhaustion. She was a ghost in a threadbare coat. "Walk beside me," I said. I didn't whisper. A man who whispers is a man who is afraid of his own truth. "Hold my arm, Evelyn." She hesitated, her fingers hovering near my wool sleeve. Then she gripped it. Her hand was cold, even through the fabric. We stepped onto the cobblestones of North Street. The year was 1892. Boston was a city of iron, steam, and rigid, unyielding glass. The panic was whispering in the shadows of the banks. Men were losing their grip on the American dream. But on this street, the only currency that mattered was reputation. We walked toward the Central Market. The city rose up to meet us with a roar. I heard the iron-rimmed wheels of the hansom cabs. They screeched against the stones like dying birds. I heard the rhythmic, heavy thud of the dray horses. Their breath hung in the air like clouds of gray silk. The newsboys were screaming about the Homestead strike. They were screaming about blood in the streets of Pennsylvania. But our war was quiet. Our war was the length of a city block. We reached the edge of the market stalls. The air changed. It became a thick, suffocating soup of brine and decay. I smelled the salted cod piled high in wooden crates. I smelled the sharp, acidic tang of fermented cider. And beneath it all, the smell of damp sawdust and horse manure. The market was a theater of the elite and the desperate. Women in silk bustles held lace handkerchiefs to their noses. They navigated the mud as if it were a minefield. Their husbands wore top hats that gleamed like wet coal. I felt the first needle prick of a gaze. It came from Mrs. Gable. She was the widow of a shipping magnate. She was the self-appointed guardian of Boston's moral compass. She stood by a pyramid of winter squash. Her gloved hand froze above a pumpkin. She looked at me, Ma. Then she looked at the child. Then her eyes landed on Evelyn with the precision of a guillotine. Evelyn stumbled. I felt the tremor in her hand through my coat. I didn't let her fall. I pulled my arm tighter against my ribs, anchoring her to me. "Eyes forward," I muttered. My voice was a low growl, meant only for her. "You are a queen among crows." We pushed into the heart of the crowd. The whispers began. They didn't start loud. They started as a hiss, like steam escaping a radiator. "Look at the carpenter," a woman murmured. Her hat was a monstrous thing of dyed feathers. "Who is the girl? I recognized that coat." And the child, look at the child's eyes. They weren't just curious, they were hungry. In this era, a woman's virtue was her only currency. To be seen with a child and no gold band was to be bankrupt. I saw a florist's daughter pull her skirts back. She acted as if Evelyn's shadow would rot the silk. My blood began to simmer. It was a slow, heavy heat in my marrow. It was the same heat I felt when a crooked foreman tried to skim my wages. We stopped at Miller's produce stand. Miller had been my friend for a decade. I was a man who knew the value of a straight line and a level floor. But today, he wouldn't look up. He was obsessed with the arrangement of his potatoes. "Morning, Miller," I said. I used my sight voice. It was the voice that carried over the sound of hammers and saws. It was the voice of authority. Miller flinched. He looked up, his eyes darting to the boy. "Thomas," he whispered, "you shouldn't be here. Not like this." I need a half bushel of your best Macintoshes, I said. I didn't acknowledge his fear, and the sharpest cheddar you have in the back. I shifted Leo in my arms. The boy stirred. He let out a soft, melodic coo. He reached out a tiny, unformed hand. He caught the edge of my beard with his fingers. The contact was electric. It was the softest thing I had ever felt in my life of calluses and scars. I looked at the circle of women watching us. They were 3 feet away. Their faces were masks of Victorian disgust. I stared back. I didn't blink. I looked at the youngest one, a girl who couldn't have been more than 20. I saw her resolve crumble under the weight of my stare. She looked down at her boots. The red ones. Evelyn? I asked. I turned to her, my expression softening. Or the green? Evelyn took a breath. It was a shaky, ragged thing. But she stepped forward. She reached into the bin of apples. Her hand was white, but her fingers were steady. The red ones are for the boy, Sat, she said. Her voice was clear. It didn't tremble. It was a bell ringing in a graveyard. He likes the sweetness. Then he shall have them, I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. I didn't hand it to Miller. I dropped it on the wooden counter. Clang. The sound was a hammer strike on an anvil. It echoed through the sudden silence of the stalls. It was the sound of a claim being staked. It said, "We are here." It said, "We have the right to breathe this air." As we waited for the change, a shadow fell over us. I smelled stale tobacco and cheap gin. It was Silas, a rigger from the wharf with a face like a crushed tin can. He was a man who lived to find the weakness in others. He spat a glob of brown juice into the mud near Evelyn's shoe. "Didn't know you were salvaging secondhand cargo. Thomas," he sneered. His voice was loud enough for the whole square to hear. The market went dead. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. I felt Evelyn turn to ice. She was a bird waiting for the stone to hit. I didn't let go of this boy. I didn't ball my free hand into a fist. I simply stepped toward Silas. I was a head taller. I was broader, built from 20 years of lifting the bones of houses. I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. I let him look at Leo. Then I let him see the ring. It was a simple brass band Evelyn had pressed into my hand before we left. It was a lie made of metal. But in that moment, it was the truest thing in the world. "This is my family." "Silas," I said. My voice was a low vibration, like a tectonic plate shifting. "You will speak of them with the respect they are owed." I leaned in closer, until I could see the broken veins in his nose. "Or you will find out how a carpenter handles a rotted plank." Silas looked into my eyes. He didn't see a neighbor. He saw a man who had finally found something worth dying for. And a man with a purpose is the most dangerous predator in the city. Silas muttered something about the humidity and backed away. He disappeared into the crowd like smoke. The tension in the air didn't evaporate. It changed. The whispers were no longer jagged. They were soft. They were filled with a sudden, confused uncertainty. By claiming the boy as my own blood, I had broken their rules. I had turned a scandal into a household. We finished the transaction in a strange, heavy peace. I carried the heavy basket of apples in one hand. I carried the future of my soul in the other. Evelyn walked beside me. She didn't look at the ground anymore. She looked at the horizon. She looked like a woman who had been resurrected. As we cleared the market, the clouds finally surrendered. The sun broke through the Boston gray. A single golden beam hit the sleeping boy's hair. It turned the fine fuzz on his head into a halo. I looked down at him. The weight on my arm didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like an anchor. It was the only thing keeping me from drifting away into the nothingness of my old life. The wealthy elite of the Back Bay could keep their silk. They could keep their hollow judgments and their cold pews. I had a heartbeat against my ribs. I had the scent of fresh fruit and wood smoke. For the first time in 20 years. I wasn't just a man waiting for the sun to set. I was a man who wanted to see the morning. We turned the corner toward the boarding house. The shadows of the building stretched out like long, dark fingers. "You didn't have to do that, Thomas," Evelyn said. Her voice was a whisper now, thick with unshed tears. "You didn't have to claim him. You didn't have to lie for us." I stopped walking. I looked at her. I saw the light catching the moisture in her eyes. I saw the strength it took for her to just stand there. I didn't do it for them, Evelyn, I said. I shifted the boy, feeling his warmth seep through my shirt. And I wasn't lying. Justice isn't something that happens in a courtroom. It's not written in the law books of men who have never been hungry. Justice is a man standing in the wind, holding a child that isn't his. Justice is the decision to be a shield. Dignity isn't given, it's fought for. It's earned in the small, quiet moments when you choose to stay. I looked at the brass ring on my finger. It was cheap. It would probably turn my skin green by nightfall. But it felt heavier than gold. Let's go home, I said. We walked into the shadows. But we weren't in the dark anymore. We were the light, and God helped the man who tried to put us out. I looked at the boy. His eyes were wide, reflecting the gray Boston sky. I did it so he wouldn't have to grow up wondering why no one stood in front of him, I whispered. The market was no longer the battlefield. The battlefield was the boy's future, and I had just fired the first shot. We reached the heavy oak door of our destination. I handed the child back to Evelyn. My arms felt strangely light, empty, cold. I watched her pull him close, and for a moment, the winter air felt sharper than a blade. I looked at my hands. They were the hands of a builder. They were stained with cedar dust and scarred by the bite of the saw. Today, I wasn't building a house. I had started building something that didn't need nails or glue. I was building a wall around a mother and her son. It was the hardest work I had ever done, and I knew the foundation was still trembling. The heavy doors of the Boston City Hall didn't just open. They groaned on massive brass hinges. The sound echoed like a cell door closing behind us. The air inside was a different world. It was a world away from the crisp morning at the market. It smelled of wet wool and stale tobacco. It smelled of the suffocating scent of old, rotting paper. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through high, arched windows. Every footstep we took on the marble floor rang out. The sound announced our arrival to the vaulted ceiling. We were intruders in this temple of ink and law. I shifted Leo in my arms again, taking him back from Evelyn as we climbed the stairs. He was awake now. He blinked at the shadows. His small, warm hand was tucked firmly into the collar of my coat. I felt the weight of the brass ring on my finger. It was a cheap piece of metal, but it felt like a branding iron. It was the mark of the lie I was prepared to live. We were led to a small, windowless office at the end of a long, dark corridor. The name on the door was etched in frosted glass. Mr. Ambrose Sterling. He didn't look up when we entered, but he was a man carved from gray stone and dried ink. His spectacles sat low on a nose that had been broken and poorly reset. He was a bureaucrat. He was the kind of man who saw the world only in columns of profit and loss. It was 1892. In Boston, men like Sterling held the power of God over the poor. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts had recently tightened the laws. They spoke of pauperism and moral neglect. The words were fancy. The meaning was simple. If a child was deemed to be in an unstable environment, the state could take them. They called it protection. We called it a nightmare. Families were being torn apart every day in the North End. The placing out system was in full swing. Children were being loaded onto trains and sent to the West. They were sent to work on farms for strangers. They called them orphan trains. I looked at Leo's soft curls. I would rather burn the city down than see him on one of those trains. Sit, Sterling said. His voice sounded like dry parchment rubbing together. Evelyn sat on the edge of the hard wooden chair. She looked so small. She looked like a bird caught in a winter gale. I stood behind her. I rested my hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a romantic gesture for the audience. It was an anchor for her soul. I could feel her trembling through the thick fabric of her cloak. Her fear was a living thing, vibrating against my palm. Sterling finally looked up. His eyes were sharp and cold behind the glass. The records for the North End district show no entry for a Leo Bennett born to a married couple, he began. He tapped a fountain pen against a heavy ledger. The sound was rhythmic, like a heartbeat. It suggests the child is a ward of the state. Miss, or should I say, Mrs. The silence in the room was heavy. It was enough to choke on. I felt Evelyn's breath hitch in her throat. She was a mother. She was a lioness. But she was also a woman who had been beaten down by a world that didn't care for her struggle. Thomas was working in the timber camps when the boy was born, Evelyn said. Her voice was thin. It was like a wire stretched to the breaking point. We were married in Maine, a small town called Skowhegan. Sterling didn't blink. He didn't care about her trembling voice. He didn't care about the way she gripped her shawl. The certificate, he asked. Lost, I said. I stepped forward. I let my voice boom in the small, cramped room. I used the tone I used when I was shouting over the roar of a sawmill. I needed to command the space. The boarding house we stayed in burned down 2 winters ago, I continued. I lost my tools, I lost our clothes, I lost our papers. I leaned over his desk. I let him see the scars on my hands. I let him see the rough, callous skin of a man who worked until his bones ached. A man doesn't need a piece of paper to know his own son. Mr. Sterling. Sterling leaned back. He was unimpressed by my size. He was unimpressed by my anger. The law, Mr. Miller, is not concerned with what a man knows, he replied. It is concerned with what can be proven. There are too many fatherless children roaming these streets. They drain the public coffers. He looked at Leo. Leo smiled without knowing his whole future depended on the next few minutes. Leo was staring back at him with wide, innocent eyes. The boy didn't know he was being discussed like a piece of faulty machinery. If the child is illegitimate, he will be moved to the state infirmary for reassignment. I saw Evelyn's face go bone white. It was the color of death. I reached down and took her hand. Her palm was slick with sweat. Her fingers were icy cold. She gripped me so hard I felt her nails through my skin. I had to give him a detail he couldn't verify. I had to give him a truth wrapped in a lie. I thought back to the stories my mother used to tell about her wedding. I remembered the way she smiled when she spoke of the rain. It was an Episcopal service, I said. I lowered my voice, making it intimate. I made it sound like a sacred memory. A Reverend Hawthorne performed it. A man with hair as white as the Maine snow. The church was built of white pine. I remember because I checked the joints. The pews smelled like linseed oil and beeswax. I looked at Evelyn. I wanted her to see the love I was pretending to remember. Evelyn wore a dress the color of a winter sky. It was her mother's lace. It rained so hard we had to wait 3 hours just to get to the carriage. I watched Sterling's eyes. I wasn't just telling a lie. I was building a house with words. I was making it solid enough for him to walk inside. I remember the way the mud looked on the floor of that church, I added. I remember the way the Reverend looked at us. He told me my only job from that day on was to be the wall. The wall between my family and the wind. I squeezed Evelyn's hand. I felt her thumb stroke the back of my hand. It was a soft, rhythmic motion. It was the most honest thing in the room. In that moment, she wasn't just a stranger I was helping. She was the woman I was choosing to protect with my life. Sterling stopped tapping his pen. The silence returned, but the air had changed. He looked at our joined hands. He looked at the way I held the boy. I didn't hold him like a stranger. I held him like a man who knew the exact weight of his own heart. Sterling knew the laws were designed to catch the lazy. He knew they were designed to catch the broken. I didn't know what to do with a man who stood like an oak. He didn't know what to do with a man who looked at a child with that kind of ferocity. But the tension remained. It was thick and suffocating. I realized then that family isn't about blood. Family isn't about a signature on a government ledger. It is about who stands in the gap. It is about who stays when the world comes to take what you love. It is the choice to be the shield. True courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else is more important than that fear. Dignity is a quiet flame that you refuse to let the wind blow out. Evelyn leaned her head against my arm for a split second. It was a gesture of pure, raw exhaustion. In that touch, I felt a decade of her pain. I felt the hunger she had hidden. I felt the nights she had spent crying in the dark. I felt the love she had for this boy. A love so vast it could swallow the ocean. My heart thudded against my ribs. It wasn't just a role I was playing anymore. The brass ring felt like gold. The lie felt like the only truth worth telling. I looked at Sterling. I dared him to challenge me. I dared him to try and take what was mine. Sterling sighed and closed the ledger. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. I will send a request for verification to the main authorities, he said. He didn't look happy. He looked tired. It will take weeks for a courier to return with the records. Until then, the child remains in your custody. He looked at me. There was a glimmer of something in his eyes. It might have been respect. It might have been pity. But if that letter comes back empty, Mr. Miller, God help you. He already has, I said. I didn't wait for him to dismiss us. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me tremble. I turned Evelyn around. I led her out of the room. We walked through the long, dark corridor. Our footsteps were faster now. The echoes were no longer a threat. They were a rhythm of escape. We didn't stop until we reached the bottom of the great stone steps outside. The Boston air was still cold. The wind still bit at our faces. But the sky looked a little brighter. Evelyn stopped. She looked at me, her eyes shimmering with tears that finally fell. "Why?" she whispered. I looked at the brass ring. I looked at her. "Because no one should have to face the wind alone," I said. We walked into the crowd. The builder and the mother. The man with the fake ring and the heart that had finally found its purpose. We were just 3 people in a city of thousands. But we were a fortress, and the world was going to have to break me to get to them. The cold air hit us like a bucket of ice water. Evelyn collapsed against a stone pillar. Her lungs finally drew in a full, shivering breath. She was still clutching my hand. Her grip was tight. It was the grip of a drowning woman holding onto a piece of driftwood. She didn't let go. "You lied," she whispered. Her voice was thin, catching on the jagged edges of the wind. "I told him a story," I replied. I looked down at the brass ring on my finger. It didn't feel like a brand of shame anymore. It felt like a tool. It was a heavy, cold instrument of survival. "He wanted to see a father," I said. So I showed him one. Leo reached out. He grabbed a lock of my hair. He gave it a tiny, forceful tug. I didn't move away. The city of Boston moved around us. It was loud. It was indifferent. Horses hammered their hooves against the cobblestones. The smell of coal smoke and salt water hung heavy over the street. For the first time, we weren't just 2 lonely people lost in the crowd. We were a singular unit. The lie had saved the boy. But it had done something more profound. It had tied me to them in a way that no truth ever could. I looked at the gray sky. The first flake of snow hit my cheek. It was a cold, silent warning. The worst of the winter was still ahead. History would remember this as a year of hard strikes and the looming shadow of the Great Panic. Money was drying up. Work was a ghost. The letter from Maine would eventually find its way back to this office. We had bought time, but time, like the seasoned oak I carved, always runs out under the blade. "Where to now?" Evelyn asked. Her eyes were searching mine. She was looking for the man I had pretended to be in that office. She was looking for the hero in the rough coat. "Home," I said. The word felt strange in my mouth. It felt like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. But as we walked away from the halls of power, I didn't let go of her hand. I couldn't, because I knew that the moment I did, the walls we had built would crumble. I wasn't ready to be alone again. Not after I had felt what it was like to be a protector. We walked toward the harbor. The steam from the potato soup rose in thick, white clouds inside the tavern. It smelled of salt, black pepper, and the honest scent of the earth. We sat in a corner booth at O'Malley's. It was a quiet place tucked away near the docks. The noise of the city was a dull roar outside the frosted windows. Evelyn didn't eat at first. She sat with her back straight. She watched the steam curl toward the ceiling. Her hands were finally still. They rested on the scarred wood of the table. The frantic energy of the City Hall office had drained out of her. It left only a hollow, beautiful exhaustion. "Eat, Evelyn," I said quietly. I pushed the plate of black bread toward her. It was dense and heavy. It was the kind of bread that sits in your stomach like a stone to keep you anchored. She took a small bite. Her movements were slow. They were mechanical. She looked at Leo. The boy was dipping a crust into the broth. His fingers were shaky. I was excited by the simple warmth. "We survived the lion's den," she whispered. "For today," I replied. I felt the weight of the day pressing on my own shoulders. I looked at my coat hanging on the peg by the door. In the hidden lining, tucked behind a loose stitch, was my life savings $14. In 1892, $14 was more than just paper and ink. It was a king's ransom for a man with no master. It was a set of professional German chisels I had dreamed of for a decade. It was a mahogany workbench I had seen at the merchant's 3 months ago. I had spent 3 long years saving every penny. I had skipped meals. I had walked miles to save a nickel on a trolley fare. I had worked the sawmill until my hands bled. A man's tools are his soul in this trade. Without them, I was just a laborer who cut wood. With them, I was a master who shaped it. I looked at Leo's thin wool jacket. The cuffs were frayed into gray threads. The fabric was so worn that I could see the light of the tavern through the elbows. He was a small boy. The Boston wind was a hungry beast. The wind didn't care about legal documents. It didn't care about the lies we told Sterling. It only cared about how much heat it could steal from a child's bones. "Stay here," I told them. "I need to check on a shipment at the wharf." It was a lie. I hate lying more than I hate a crooked joist, but some lies are just the scaffolding you need to build a better truth. I walked out into the biting air. The cold hit me like a physical blow. It reminded me why we were doing this. The clothier 3 doors down was run by a man named Miller. He was no relation to me. He sold heavy wool coats and boots that could withstand a mountain winter. I walked to the back. I went where the children's items were kept. I pointed to a small, navy blue peacoat. It had heavy brass buttons. The lining felt like a sheep's back. $6, the merchant said. His eyes scanned my rough clothes. He didn't think I had $6. "And the boots?" I asked. I pointed to a pair of thick leather ones. They had reinforced toes. They were built for a boy who had a long way to walk. "4 more, the merchant replied. I felt the weight of my dream leaving my pocket. $10, the chisels, the mahogany workbench, the future I had built in my head since I was a boy in the timber camps. I didn't hesitate. I counted out the bills. My fingers lingered on the paper for just a second. I wasn't mourning the money. I was mourning the version of myself that was a master carpenter. I walked back to the tavern. The brown paper parcel was tucked under my arm. Evelyn looked up as I slid back into the booth. Her eyes went to the package immediately. "What is that, Thomas?" she asked. Her voice was cautious. It was tinged with a fear of more debt. I didn't look at her directly. "Ran into an old friend from the logging days," I said. "A man they call Big Jim. He's moving his family south to the Carolinas tomorrow. His boy outgrew these. Jim didn't want to pack them, said they were just taking up space. He'd rather see them go to someone who could use them." I pushed the parcel across the table. Evelyn's hand moved toward the paper. She stopped. She wasn't a fool. She knew there was no Big Jim. She knew the smell of brand new wool. She knew fresh leather didn't come from a dusty travel trunk. But she also knew the weight of my pride. If I called it a gift from me, she would feel the need to refuse it. She had nothing left to give me but her thanks. And she was too proud to give those away for free, so she let the lie stand between us. It was a quiet bridge we both agreed to cross. She opened the paper. Leo let out a small gasp. His eyes widened. He touched the brass buttons like they were made of solid gold. "Try it on, son," I said. The coat fit him perfectly. It swallowed his thin frame. It made him look sturdy. It made him look like a boy who was loved. I looked like a child who belonged to a man who could provide. I went back to my soup. It tasted like ash now, $10 gone. My career as a master carpenter had just been pushed back another year, maybe 2. In the late 19th century, a man's reputation was his only currency. But as I watched Leo beam at his new boots, I realized something. Reputation is what people say about you. Character is what you do when the world isn't looking. Evelyn reached across the table. She didn't take my hand this time. She just brushed her fingers against my sleeve. It was a touch so light I almost missed it, but it burned hotter than the soup. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered. She didn't mention Big Jim. She didn't mention the money. She just looked at me with a clarity that stripped me bare. In that moment, I wasn't a liar. I wasn't a failed builder. I was exactly who she needed me to be. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the realization that something else is more important than your own comfort. Justice isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes, it's found in a pair of boots and a warm coat. We sat there for a long time. The snow began to pile up against the glass. The world outside was freezing over, but inside the booth, there was a heat that no winter could touch. We were a fortress of 3. The price of entry had been my dream. But looking at the boy's smile, it was the best bargain I ever made. I stood up and settled the bill for the soup. I had $4 left. It was enough for a room. It was enough for one more day of being a family. And in 1892, one more day was everything. The guild contracts were a ghost. They hovered over the snow like a promise I was about to break. If the wealthy families of Beacon Hill saw me now, my name would be erased from their ledgers. They wanted craftsmen with impeccable reputations. They wanted men who didn't walk with fallen women. Evelyn was a mark on a clean page. By standing beside her, I was inviting the ink to spill on me too. I was trading my place in the sun for a boy's quiet warmth. Leo stood tall in his new blue peacoat, his chest puffed out. A tiny, rare smile touched his lips. It was the first time I hadn't seen his shoulders hunched against the world. His posture told the story of a child who finally felt seen. I realized then that a house isn't built of white pine or sturdy oak. It is built of what you are willing to burn. You must be the fuel to keep the others inside from shivering. I am a carpenter by trade and by soul. I know how to calculate the cost of a build down to the last copper nail, and for the first time in my life, the profit didn't matter. The ledger was empty, and I didn't care. I only cared about the foundation of the 3 of us. We finished our meal in a silence that felt like a prayer. The soup was gone. The bread was nothing but crumbs on a chipped plate. The world outside O'Malley's was still cold. It was still judgmental. It was still waiting to swallow us whole. But inside that booth, the wind couldn't reach my skin. I was tied to them now, not by a bloodline or a legal name. I was tied by a blue coat and a shared sacrifice. I stood up and pulled on my own worn jacket. I felt the empty spot in my pocket where my savings used to sit. "Ready?" I asked. Evelyn looked at me. She truly looked at me. She didn't thank me with cheap words. She didn't have to. She reached out and brushed a stray bit of sawdust from my sleeve. It was a small, domestic gesture. It was the softest thing I had ever felt in my life. We walked out of the diner together. 2 outcasts and a boy in a brand new coat. I didn't care who saw us under the flickering gaslights. The wood could wait. The ambition could wait. The boy couldn't. The sun began its long lean toward the horizon. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum. We stood over a heavy iron pot in the small, muddy yard behind the boarding house. Making soap is a patient man's chore. It requires a steady fire. It requires a steadier hand. I had brought a bucket of clean wood ash from my workshop. The ash was the residue of a dozen finished homes. Evelyn had the rendered beef tallow. It was white and heavy in a ceramic crock. The smell of the melting fat was thick. It was primal. It hung in the damp afternoon air like a heavy wool blanket. Then came the lye. I poured the water through the ashes slowly. I watched the dark, caustic liquid trickle into the pot. Lye is a dangerous thing. It can eat through a man's skin as fast as a bad rumor. "Stir it slow, Thomas," Evelyn whispered. Her voice was a soft anchor in the steam. She held a small muslin bag. It was filled with dried lavender buds. She had grown them in a window box. It was her tiny bit of beauty in a gray, industrial city. I took the long wooden paddle. I began the rhythmic work. The mixture hissed and bubbled. It was a violent transformation hidden in the clouds of steam. The acrid bar, sharp bite of the chemical rose up. It stung my nostrils and made my eyes water. Evelyn leaned in close. She began to sprinkle the lavender. The sweetness of the flowers fought against the bitterness of the lye. It was a strange, haunting scent. It smelled like a clean house and a dirty grave all at once. Leo was inside, finally exhausted from the morning's tensions. He was napping on a pile of thin blankets. I was still wearing his new blue peacoat. The boy refused to take it off. Even in his dreams, I watched the soap thicken under my paddle. It turned from clear oil to something solid. Evelyn's face was flushed from the heat of the fire. She looked at the swirling white mass as if it were a crystal ball. She saw her future in the bubbles. "Thomas," she said. Her voice was barely audible over the crackle of the burning wood. You never asked about the man who gave him that coat." I didn't stop my rhythm. The paddle moved in a slow, heavy circle. "I figured the truth would find its own way to the surface," I replied. "The truth always does. It's like a knot in a piece of pine. You can sand it down, but the grain never lies." She reached out and touched the rim of the pot. Her fingers were trembling. "You know Caleb died before he could return to us," she said. "But I never told you how completely the law erased him. There was no certificate, no pension, and no name beside Leo's in the ledger. To the government, Caleb had never been a husband at all." The paddle felt heavier in my hands. I thought about the men I had known in the logging camps, hard men who died for a meager paycheck. They were buried before the evening whistle blew. The world of 1892 had no room for unrecorded promises. A woman without a certificate was a woman without a name. She was telling me why she lied at City Hall. It wasn't about vanity. It wasn't about greed. It was her only life raft in a sea of hungry sharks. She was giving Caleb's son a floor to stand on. She was fighting for his dignity. "They didn't even send his boots back," she said. A single tear traced a path through the ash dust on her cheek. "He died for a country that doesn't acknowledge he ever loved anyone." I stopped stirring. The steam swirled around us. It smelled of sharp lye and soft lavender. It was the scent of a memory being forced to come clean. I looked at her. The firelight danced in the dampness of her eyes. "A man's life isn't measured by a clerk's ink." "Evelyn," I said. My voice was thick with a conviction I didn't know I possessed. I looked at my own calloused palms. They were stained with walnut oil. They were marked by old scars from slipped chisels. "I've built houses for men who had every paper in the world. Their foundations were rot. Their beams were hollow." Caleb gave the boy his eyes. "You gave him his heart. I'm just here to provide the wood for the frame." She wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. It was a sudden, sharp movement. The vulnerability vanished in an instant. It was replaced by that iron resolve I had seen before. "The lie is set," she noted. Her voice was steady again. "It's time to pour." I lifted the heavy iron pot. My muscles strained against the weight of the cooling mass. The heat radiated against my chest. We moved together toward the wooden molds. I had notched them earlier that morning with my finest soap. The liquid soap flowed out. It was thick. It was creamy. It filled the boxes to the very brim. Tomorrow, it would be hard enough to cut into bars. Tomorrow, it would be something that could wash away the grit of the docks. It would be a product for the market. It would be bread on the table. We stood there in the dying light of the Massachusetts evening. The steam slowly dissipated into the cold Boston air. The secret was out now. It sat between us like the cooling soap. It was heavy. It was undeniable. She wasn't just a woman in trouble. She was a widow of a war the city had already chosen to forget. She was a guardian of a ghost. I looked at the boarding house. It was a crumbling structure of brick and despair, but inside, a boy was sleeping in a blue coat. I was warm because of a lie. He was safe because of a carpenter's pride. True justice isn't found in the law books of men. It's found in the things we do when the world isn't looking. It's found in the ash and the tallow. It's found in the lavender that hides the sting of the lie. I reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cold, but her grip was like iron. We weren't just making soap. We were washing the world clean of its cruelty. The 1890s were a hard time for the broken, but as long as I had a hammer and she had her heart, we would build something. We would build a fortress that no army could tear down. The sun disappeared. The first stars began to poke through the smog of the factories. "We should go inside," I said. She nodded. We left the pot to cool in the mud. We walked toward the door, side by side. The guild could have their contracts. The wealthy could have their Beacon Hill mansions. I had the smell of lavender on my skin. I had the truth in my soul, And in 1892, that was the only wealth that mattered. I stood in the gloaming, watching the house where a child slept in a coat bought with a dead man's dream. The $14 I had spent felt heavy in my memory, yet light in my conscience. It was a small price to pay for the temporary repair of a shattered soul. I wasn't just playing a role for a single afternoon. I was standing guard over a history that had no other protectors. The sun dropped below the roofline, casting the yard into deep, violet shadow. "Thank you for stirring, Thomas," she whispered. Her voice was like the softest sandpaper on fine-grained oak. The lie can be too much for one person to handle alone. I set the heavy iron pot down on the frozen earth. I kicked dirt over the dying embers of the fire, watching the orange sparks fly into the darkening sky. The smell of lavender clung to my wool coat like a persistent memory. It was the scent of a promise kept in the dark. I walked her toward the door. The silence between us no longer a wall of glass. It had become a porch, a place where two people could sit and watch the world go by without fear. We were no longer two strangers trading desperate favors in a cruel city. We were two people holding a ghost's hand, trying to find a path toward the morning. The Harvard Bridge loomed ahead of us, a skeletal titan of iron and rivets stretching across the Charles River. It was a new wonder of the age, completed only a year prior, still smelling of fresh paint and cold seawater. The wind did not merely blow across the water, it carved. It sought out the gaps in our threadbare coats. It looked for the cracks in our resolve. Leo walked between us, his small, mittened hand tucked firmly into mine. I could feel the rough calluses of my thumb pressing against his soft, innocent knuckles. He was looking at the ice floes drifting in the river below. His eyes were wide with the wonder only a child can afford when they feel safe. We reached the center of the span where the iron felt most hollow beneath our boots. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon, bleeding a bruised orange across the frozen world. Evelyn stopped suddenly. She leaned her weight against the cold iron railing. She looked at the city of Boston, a cluster of brick and smoke that had never promised her a single kindness. Then she looked at me. Her eyes weren't tired anymore. They were breaking. A sob caught in her throat, sharp and sudden like a snapping branch. It was the sound of a structural beam giving way under a weight it was never meant to carry. She didn't turn away this time to hide her face. She let the tears fall, hot and fast, onto her frayed woolen scarf. "Why, Thomas just," she whispered. Her voice was thin, nearly lost to the roar of the Atlantic wind. "Why would you do all of this for a woman you barely know?" I didn't have a grand speech prepared for her. I am a man of measurements, joints, and physical truths, not a man of poetry. "Because the world is cold enough without us helping it stay that way," I said. She shook her head, her breath hitching in the frigid, salt-heavy air. "I've spent years being a problem to be solved by the parish," she cried. "A ghost to be ignored by the neighbors in the hallway. A shadow in a boarding house kitchen, hoping the floorboards wouldn't creak and wake the landlord." She reached out and gripped the iron railing until her knuckles turned white as bone. "But today, just for these few hours, I felt like a person again. I felt like a wife who was cherished and a mother who was protected from the storm. For the first time since the world turned gray, I felt like I mattered to someone." I stepped closer, closing the gap the winter had made between us. I pulled her into the shelter of my heavy jacket, the one that still smelled of cedar and hard work. I reached down and lifted Leo up, tucking him into the warm space between our chests. He was a heavy, solid weight, a tiny engine of life wrapped in new blue wool. I could feel his heart thudding against my ribs, steady and fast, like a drum in a distant parade. It was the only rhythm that mattered in all of Massachusetts that night. Evelyn buried her face in my shoulder, her weeping turning into a rhythmic trembling. I rested my chin on the top of her head, feeling the softness of her hair against my skin. The scent of the lavender soap we had made earlier clung to her like a blessing. It mixed with the smell of the salt spray and the copper tang of the coming snow. I thought about my empty workshop back in the North End. I thought about the years I spent counting the rings in dead wood because I had no living people to count on. But here, on a bridge to nowhere in particular, I felt the gravity of a real life pulling at me. I wasn't a man who had failed to start a family. In that frozen moment, I was a man standing in the center of one. The snow began to fall, light and silent as ash from a distant fire. It dusted the iron of the bridge and the dark wool of our shoulders. We were three solitary figures etched against a vast, white canvas. The city lights began to flicker on in the distance, tiny sparks of defiance against the encroaching dark. I held them tighter as the temperature plunged toward zero. I didn't care about the lie we had told the clerk at the market. I didn't care about the money I had spent on a coat that would be outgrown by spring. I only cared about the heat radiating from the boy's chest. It was a small, flickering fire, but it was enough to keep the frost from reaching my soul. We stood there until the gold light vanished completely and the deep blue of the night took over. The silence was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was a blanket, shared and warm. I realized then that a single day can be a lifetime if you live it with the right people. I didn't let go of them. I wasn't ready to find out what happened to my heart when the warmth stopped. The walk back from the Charles River was longer than the walk there had been. The snow no longer fell in soft, romantic flakes. It hissed against the cobblestones like a warning from a forgotten god. Leo was a heavy, warm anchor asleep against my neck now. I could feel his steady breath, a small, humid rhythm of life that I would have to give back in a few blocks. Evelyn walked beside me in a silence that felt like the closing of a very long book. The city of Boston seemed to shrink around us as we entered the narrow streets. The tall brick buildings leaned in, their dark windows watching our masquerade come to an end. We reached the narrow, uneven stoop of her boarding house on Salem Street. The yellow light from the hallway leaked out from under the door, thin and pale as a dying hope. I shifted the boy's weight carefully, feeling the transition of his heat away from my body. I handed him to her. My arms felt suddenly, violently light. The cold rushed into the space where his small chest had been pressed against mine. Evelyn adjusted him on her hip, her movements practiced, weary, and full of a mother's grace. She didn't go inside the house immediately. She stood on the bottom step so we were eye to eye in the gaslight. "The day is over. Thomas," she said. Her voice was a low vibration in the frigid, midnight air. I nodded, my throat feeling like it was lined with the very sawdust from my shop floor. "He'll sleep through the night," I said, pointing to the sleeping Leo. "The hot soup and the long walking. It's a good kind of tired for a young boy." She reached into the deep, dark pocket of her wool coat. She pulled out a small object that glinted sharply under the flickering gaslight of the street lamp. She took my hand, her fingers trembling and ice cold against my rough, scarred skin. She pressed a silver ring into the center of my palm. It was thin, worn almost smooth by years of worry and work. There was a faint, ghostly pattern of ivy carved into the metal. It was cold, holding the deep chill of the Boston winter in its very marrow. "I can't take this, Evelyn," I whispered. The ring felt like a hot coal in my hand, though it was freezing. It was her wedding ring. It was the last piece of her past that hadn't been eaten by hunger or rent. "You must," she said, her voice strengthening with a sudden, fierce dignity. "A man who gives his sweat and his silver to a stranger deserves more than a thank you. This ring is the only thing I own that still has value. If I keep it, I am just a woman holding on to a memory of a man who is gone. If I give it to you, it becomes a payment for a man who is here." I looked at the ring, then at her face. In 1892, a woman's dignity was often the only thing the law couldn't take from her. She was offering me her pride so she wouldn't feel like a beggar. I closed my fingers over the silver. I didn't want the metal. I wanted the weight of the moment to last forever. "I will keep it safe," I said. "Not as payment, but as a deposit on the next time you need a stir for your pot." She smiled then, a small, flickering thing that was more beautiful than the sunrise. She turned and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The light from the hallway swallowed her and the boy. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing down the empty, snow-covered street. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the silver ring pressed tight in my fist. The wind howled down Salem Street, whipping the snow into white ghosts. I turned toward the north end, my boots crunching on the fresh powder. The world was still cold. The panic was coming. And the factories were still hungry for the souls of the poor. But as I walked, I didn't feel the chill. I felt the ghost of a boy's heartbeat against my ribs. I felt the scent of lavender in my lungs. I had $14 less in my pocket than I had this morning. But as I reached my shop, I realized I had never been a wealthier man in my entire life. Justice isn't a gavel in a courtroom. It's a carpenter refusing to let a woman's fire go out. It's the courage to be a father for a day when the world offers no rewards. I unlocked my door and stepped into the smell of sawdust and home. I put the silver ring on my workbench, right next to my favorite chisel. Tomorrow, I would go back to being a man of wood and nails. But tonight, I was the man who had kept the winter at bay. And in the winter of 1892, that was the only victory that mattered. The silver ring sat in my palm like a drop of moonlight. I knew its weight without asking. It was the final piece of her father's legacy. It was the only thing the pawn shops on Hanover Street hadn't devoured. "You must take it," she said. Her grip tightened on my rough fingers. Her skin was cold, but her eyes were burning. "A carpenter should own something that doesn't splinter," she whispered. I looked down at the band. The metal was worn, etched with a pattern of ivy that had almost smoothed away. It represented a man who had died in a war that never learned his name. "The debt is settled, Evelyn," I said. I tried to press it back into her hand. "The clerk is gone. The neighbors have stopped their whispering. Leo has a coat that will last until the spring." She didn't take it. She looked past me, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon where the harbor dissolved into the Atlantic. "I'm leaving tomorrow, Thomas." The words hit me with the force of a falling timber. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The winter air seemed to turn to glass in my lungs. "The morning train, us," she continued. Her voice found a new, desperate kind of strength. "We are going to California. I have a cousin in a valley near the Sierras. He says they need teachers. He says they need laundry and honest people who aren't afraid of the sun." I looked at the soot-stained brick of the boarding house. I thought about my workshop just 3 blocks away. I thought about the scent of pine shavings. I thought about the silence that usually waited for me there. "Why did you ask me to do all this?" I asked. My voice sounded like gravel under a boot. "If you were leaving, why the play at the city hall? Why the long walk on the bridge?" She stepped closer. The faint scent of the lavender soap we had shared earlier rose from her wool shawl. "Because I was terrified," she confessed. Her eyes welled with a sudden, shimmering honesty. "For 3 years, I have been a woman looked at with pity or disgust. I was starting to believe I was nothing more than a shadow. A ghost trying to keep a child warm in a city that wanted us to vanish." She looked toward the door where Leo had disappeared. "I needed to know that I could still belong to a family. I needed to feel for just one son that I wasn't walking into the wilderness alone." She placed her hand over mine, covering the ring. "You gave me the strength to be the woman who can survive the West, Thomas. You gave that boy a father to remember when the road gets long and the nights get cold." I closed my fingers around the silver. The metal was finally beginning to steal the heat from my skin. "California is a world away," I said. "It is a place where the sun doesn't hide behind factory smoke," she replied. A ghostly smile touched her lips. The wind howled down the alleyway. It was a sharp, mournful cry. It sounded like a violin string snapping in an empty room. It tore the remaining warmth from the doorstep. "I should go," I said. I wanted to say 1,000 other things. I wanted to tell her that I had more coins hidden under my floorboards. I wanted to tell her that a house built by a man alone is just a box for waiting. But the words were too large for a man who lived in precise measurements. I was a man of wood and nails. She was a woman of wind and horizon. She leaned forward. She pressed her forehead against mine for a single, agonizing heartbeat. It was a goodbye that tasted of salt and iron. "Goodbye, Thomas the carpenter," she whispered. She turned and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The yellow light from the hallway swallowed her. The latch clicked into place. It was a sound of absolute finality. I stood on the sidewalk. My boots sank into the fresh, indifferent snow. I watched the second-floor window. A lamp flickered on. Then it dimmed. The wind whipped my coat around my legs. It mocked the heat I had felt only an hour before. I was 34 years old. I was once again a man alone in a city of thousands. I reached into my pocket. I touched the silver ring. The day had been a beautiful lie, but the weight in my pocket was the truth. I turned toward the north end. I walked back to my shop where the sawdust waited like old dust. The winter air felt thinner. It felt as if the oxygen had departed with the boys' laughter. I didn't look back. A carpenter knows that once a joint is cut, you cannot put the wood back together. You can only build something new from the pieces left on the floor. I walked into the dark. The silver ring was a cold promise against my hip. The silence of Boston was no longer a piece, it was a ghost. 10 years is a long time for a piece of wood to sit in the sun. It warps, it turns silver, it forgets the shape of the tree it once was. But 10 years is nothing to a memory held in the palm of a calloused hand. It is 1902 now. Boston has traded its horse-drawn carriages for the hum of electric streetcars. The gas lamps of Salem Street are gone. They have been replaced by the cold, steady glow of incandescent bulbs. The world feels faster. It feels louder. In 1897, I stood on the corner and watched them build the first subway in the country. I saw the earth opened up like a wound. I saw progress burying the history of our fathers. I am still a carpenter. The sawdust still clings to my beard like premature gray. But my shop has changed. It is no longer just a place where things are made for profit. I find myself building cradles for the neighborhood women who have no husbands. I build sturdy stools for the boys who wander in from the street. They look for a place to sit. They look for a place to feel safe. I don't charge them for the oak or the time. I charge them only with a promise. Stay out of trouble, I tell them. Be a man who stands for something. Around my neck, hidden beneath my flannel shirt, hangs the silver ring. It hangs on a simple twine cord. It has grown warm against my skin. It is a permanent part of my body's temperature. I often catch myself rubbing the ivy pattern through the fabric of my clothes. It is a rhythmic habit. It is a prayer without words. I wonder if the sun in California has been kind to her. I imagine a valley where the air doesn't taste like coal and grease. I see Leo in my mind. He is no longer a heavy weight in my arms. He is a young man now. Perhaps he is walking through rows of orange trees. Perhaps he is studying law or medicine. I wonder if he remembers the man who carried him across a bridge. I wonder if he remembers the smell of cedar and the sound of the wind. Probably not. Children are like soft clay. The first impressions are often smoothed over by the hands of time, but I like to think that somewhere in the marrow of his bones, there is a feeling, a sense of being protected, a knowledge that a man can be a father just by choosing to be there. Justice is not always found in the courthouse. Sometimes. Justice is a man keeping a promise to a woman he will never see again. Dignity is not found in wealth. It is found in the way we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. Sometimes. I walk down to the harbor. The Atlantic is vast. The continent behind me is even larger. Evelyn and I were two ships that shared a harbor for a single night. We stayed together to survive a gale. We didn't need a marriage license to be a family. We didn't need years of history to justify our sacrifice. We only needed to be human at the exact moment the other was breaking. The world tells us that love is a long, slow-burning fire, but that winter taught me something different. Love can be a single match struck in a pitch-black room. It doesn't have to last forever to be real. It only has to be bright enough to show you the way out of the dark. Last week, a letter arrived at my shop. The envelope was worn. It was postmarked from a small town near the Sierra Nevada mountains. Inside, there was no letter. There was only a small, pressed flower. A California poppy. It was orange and gold, like a piece of the sun itself, and there was a photograph. A tall young man stood next to a woman with graying hair. She was wearing a dress the color of the sky. She looked healthy. She looked whole. On the back, in a script I recognized from a decade ago, were 3 words, "We are warm." I sat down at my workbench. The smell of fresh pine was heavy in the air. I held the photograph against my chest, right over the silver ring. I thought about the panic of 1893. I thought about the bread lines and the broken men I had seen. I thought about the hunger and the cold. But looking at that picture, I knew I had won. I had saved them. And in saving them, I had saved the only part of myself that mattered. I am an old carpenter in a changing city. My joints ache when the damp ocean air rolls in. But my heart is a house that is finally full. True courage isn't the absence of fear. It is the willingness to give everything for a future you will never see. It is the strength to let go when your hands want to hold on. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the wood. I was a man of wood and nails. But I was also a man who had been loved for a day. And in this life, that is more than enough. I picked up my chisel. There was work to be done. There were more cradles to build. There was more light to let into the world. The snow began to fall outside the window, but for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel the chill. I was warm,